Hello, I'm Matthew Minard. I apologize that during today's Maritain Musings, it seems that we had some technical issues with my microphone. It's a little bit distant. I have several microphones that are hooked up to my setup, and it seems that I did not double check because I've gotten into the habit of this always working correctly. And so, in the interest of respecting the time that we had today with Dr. West, I want to leave the interview stand. He did most of the talking, so it should be fine. But I apologize for my own sound issues in today's podcast. So I hope you enjoy the episode, and I'll let us go ahead now to the standard introduction. Hello, welcome to Maritain Musings, a production of the American Maritain Association. I'm Dr. Matthew Minard, and I'm here today with Dr. Jason West from Newman Theological College, a fellow Maritanista from Canada, and we're going to be talking today about the person and the common good. So I just want to welcome you, Dr. West, to be here with us.
Thank you, Dr. Menard. Happy to be here.
Great. So can you just say something to us, in general, and go on as long as you want about yourself? Of course, you should introduce yourself to our listeners and viewers, but then also to the connection of your work to Maritain. And I feel the need to make sure I rip it's not really a scab, but to let everyone know you have a forthcoming book on Maritain, so you can take the arc all the way up to there.
Okay, sure. Well, I guess my entree into Maritain kind of occurred gradually. When I was a graduate student, I think I first heard about Maritain during my doctoral program. I studied with Jenny Ashworth, who was a historian of medieval logic and philosophy of language, and didn't, I think, have a lot of patience for Maritain's approach. So it was occasionally mentioned derisively, which caught my interest. And then after that, I worked with two other professors where Maritain came up. One was with Margaret Moore, who's an expert in liberal political thought. And so I read Rawls' work and all these sorts of things with her. And at the time, I was going to Maritain's political philosophy to look for ways of engaging that tradition, critiquing those kinds of approaches, and found him quite helpful. And then I also did studies in metaphysics with a fellow, Jerry Campbell, who had been a student, had done his own graduate studies decades before at Laval with Charles de Koning. So he mentioned some of the debates we'll talk about today, and got interested in it that way. Once I left my graduate program and started teaching, I went from, being as graduate students do, working on very careful piecemeal problems, and to teaching 10 different courses in philosophy on a 2-year rotation. Basically all of the philosophy courses needed for ordination requirements, which is everything.
You were the one-man show. You got to do the whole.
Yeah. I was the first full-time philosopher my college had hired, because it primarily served the seminary formation, and so I did everything initially. So with that, I began to go to Maritain for where I was teaching, not so much as things for the students to read, but for my own formation, really, because I was teaching such a broad array of subjects. And Maritain, as probably anybody watching this knows, has a book about everything, between 1 and 5 or 6 on any topic you might want. And so I went
at least a couple of essays that still go into much more detail than one would expect from an essay.
Yeah. So really, I found them very helpful for my own thinking through of the issues that I was teaching, and a way of being able to present the material to seminary and lay students in a way that was both authentically Catholic and integrated, that it wasn't just a bunch of texts that they were studying on different subjects, but what Maritain gave me was a way of pulling them all together. And as I got into that, I began realizing, well, I'd read a lot of Maritain. I started putting the material together into the book that you mentioned, which, because I got sucked into administrative responsibilities, took me about 14 or so years to write. And so really, as a result of that, uh, got to know Maritain much more deeply, began to read through his significant corpus. And that's sort of where I am today.
Well, good, good. I mean, it'll be, great to have. We mentioned, I think, in texting a little bit about your connection to Laval. So that's going to be, I'm kind of interested in where that's going to go today. I
Yeah.
can't resist. I think I remember you posted on Facebook whenever Dr. Ashworth passed away.
Mm-hmm.
Weird to say Jenny. I apologize.
Oh,
She's
yes.
E.J. Ashworth in my book.
Yes. Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
And so, just a little bit, I'm a little bit intrigued. I mean, just very briefly, I would be surprised that she would even interact much at all with Maritain, just because there's such a divergence of kind of the historian of medieval thought, and the sorts of things he's doing, and her work being primarily in the world of not, is it fair to say primarily in the world of, logic, semantics, things of that sort? That's what I know her
Yeah.
from.
Yeah.
You
And really, I mean, her approach is very textual. She's far more interested, or was far more interested in, editing manuscripts and these sorts of things. She would occasionally mention, figures like Gilson and Maritain, I think, for uh, the students' sake, to make us aware of, more recent developments and that sort of thing. But yeah, she was very historical. I remember reading with her Augustine on free choice of the will and being very puzzled by the fact that he develops different notions of freedom at different points in the text. And I laid them all out and said, this is what I'm finding there, but I can't figure out which one is the right one. And her reply was, well, that's not my job.
like,
And maybe, if that's really your question, you should see a priest rather than a professor,
oh my goodness, it's interesting. I mean,
which I did, but,
yeah,
it was helpful advice. But yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
interesting. Yeah,
But it
yeah,
gives you a sense of, she
yeah,
was very
yeah.
interested more in exegetical, historical questions.
In a dyspeptic mode, I would be negative, but I feel a certain filial piety toward her just because the work of her and others sort of in that circle, Jan Pinborg and others, were important during writing my dissertation. So
Mm-hmm.
whenever you posted that, I thought this is always a
Yeah,
good thing for me to push back against my dislike of textualism, because I
yeah,
tend to be full-throated
yeah,
Janista.
yeah.
Well,
Well, she
okay.
was very charitable in letting me, work on St. Thomas and
Ugh.
things that were a little bit alongside her own main research interests. So.
Yeah. Yeah, you were very warm, I remember in that. So, and I was interested too. I maybe I saw that she was Jennifer. I couldn't remember. 'Cause I thought I gotta dig this up. What woman who was hiding her name, I guess, because of the era.
Could be, yeah, yeah.
So all right. Well, let's go ahead and jump in. The person of the common good. So I at least remember a story that was told to me by a Byzantine priest friend of mine from his days at Notre Dame, for his doctorate. And he claims that there was, I don't remember if it was actually like a proctor for a class or something, because it was not, I'm pretty sure it was not McInerney himself. So I don't think McInerney would have said this. But someone who was, proctoring a class comes in and says that this was the most, well, my copy of Person of the Common Good has a seal on it from having been a graduate student. So I'm going to hold the back up. This book is, something like one of the most dangerous books, written, by a Catholic thinker, which, he was sort of struck by, having, come in and prepared for the class. I'm sure that, those who are normal listeners are aware, at least somewhat, of the controversy that surrounds this text. Though some don't even know the kind of chronology, because in some sense, the controversy happens before the text comes out. And the Person of the Common Good is written already after a significant controversy had unfolded in the American, Canadian, French scene. So maybe you can just outline, a bit of the controversy leading up to the writing of the articles, which became the Person and the Common Good. And then we'll transition into the text itself.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think probably the remote background for us is really Maritain's writing of Integral Humanism, which was a very popular and influential work, which over time, there had been some calls or discussion to have it placed on the index of forbidden books by the church, which never occurred. but was certainly in the air and discussed. And then in 1943, Charles de Connick, who was a Belgian philosopher living and working in Canada, wrote a famous book called The Primacy of the Common Good Against the Personalists, which some took to be a reference to Jacques Maritain, whose political philosophy was often characterized as being a kind of personalism. Personalism was a sort of idea in the air at the time. In this text, Maritain refers to it more as an aspiration than a doctrine. So there's a number of different philosophers who had different theories. Emmanuel Munet being a prominent one, who were talked about as personalists. And so one of the problems with initially with de Connick's work was, although it's a refutation of personalism, he never names particular authors or philosophers that he is critiquing under that nomenclature. So we're left to figure out for ourselves who the personalists are. And this seemed to some, both those who liked de Connick's critique and those who objected to it, to be perhaps a reference to Maritain. And so in light of that kind of critical atmosphere of Maritain's work within some branches of the church, there was a Dominican, Father Ignatius Eschmann, who wrote a really incendiary essay entitled "In Defense of Jacques Maritain," where he critiques at some length Professor de Connick's book, and particularly taking it to be a veiled reference to Maritain. And there's some reason that might be the case, or to think that might be the case at the time. One was, as we said, Maritain's identification with the personalist movement. The other is the title of the book itself, The Primacy of the Common Good. One of Maritain's earlier works, if we were to translate the title literally from the French, was called The Primacy of the Spiritual. It is translated into English as The Things That Are Caesar's, or is it The Things That Are Not Caesar's?
Things that are not, yeah.
I forget. But in any case, it's a creative translation of the title.
Well, they republished it. I think the New Cluny edition, which is just a republication, has both.
Okay.
Yeah, at least inside jacket. But okay, keep going, because
sure. So Eschmann has this very powerful critique, powerful in the sense of very polemical. So I just noted a passage here which gives you a little bit of the flavor of this.
It's fine.
Yeah. So he says, well, such are Professor de Connick's doctrines and arguments at this juncture. If they were true, then the personalists, and with them all the Christian fathers and theologians and philosophers, should close their shops, go home and do penance in sackcloth and ashes for having grossly erred and misled the Christian world for almost 2,000 years. So he's not mincing words.
Yeah, he definitely turned the heat up, or the heat of the station up. Yeah.
Yeah. And then Charles de Connick replied with an essay in Laval Philosophique Theologique, a journal at the University of Laval, which was longer than his original text, called In Defense of St. Thomas, where he tries to reply to these. And then there's other Thomists who get into this discussion. Notably, Yves Simon, who, writing before Eschmann, argued that there wasn't, in his view, no substantive difference between Maritain's view and that of de Connick. And so de Connick, I think, somewhat reasonably suggests in his essay, replying to Eschmann, well, if Eschmann thinks it's obvious that he's critiquing Maritain and is so radically different from him, And another knowledgeable proponent of Maritain's thought, Yves Simon, sees no difference at all. It's not really for him to arbitrate whether his view is the same as or different from Maritain's, and he seems to imply there and in other places that Maritain was not at least the direct object of his critique. So I mean, I take that more or less at face value, but there's still a question of how these two thoughts, ways of thinking about the person and the common good might relate to one another.
So, yeah, I have a couple different things in my mind that maybe just we'll do like a rapid fire. I've never done this with someone on here before, but I've been thinking about this a lot. I had a student that I helped with a thesis on this topic, which I tend to avoid because I had a lot of peers when I was in graduate school who were from Thomas Aquinas College, which, as you know, is pretty much a Laval bastion. And so
Yes.
I kept my head down. But I got back into rereading the text, but also like the correspondence, which the correspondence between Simon and Maritain, which I almost was like in an emotional state. Like, I was so in the midst of the frustrations, especially that Simone expresses. Simone comes across as the one who's most vociferous. So I've just been thinking about it. One thing I've been prone to saying, and this could be the minored reading Maritain through Garrigou-Lagrange too much thing that I do. I'm always trying to emphasize Maritain's connection with the tradition. I don't like even thinking of Maritain as a personalist. How do you respond?
Well, I would tend to think there's a quotation from Aquinas that Gilson gives in his response to Father Regis in Being and Some Philosophers, that wisdom does not quibble about words. So I mean, you can call him a personalist or not. I mean, I would go back to his claim in Person and the Common Good that personalism is really more an aspiration. I mean, certainly he wants to place the notion of the person at the center of philosophical anthropology and political thought. So I think that's fine. I would take it more or less similarly to discussions of whether we should call him a Thomist existentialist. Again, I think these terms, there's something true to them, but they also, in the practical, cultural context we're in, can give rise to misunderstandings for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then, well, maybe we'll leave the Eshman in the background to make them up whenever we talk about the text itself. One thing I found interesting in the correspondence is how much Simone wants him to distance himself from Eshman. Now, I've met people who basically say because Maritain doesn't disavow Eshman, right? He recognizes him in the text. That this is sort of an acceptance of Eshman's reading of him. I tend to think of it as Maritain based on the correspondence, and it's not 100% clear. Just he wanted to respect the fact that Eshman stuck his neck out for him. I guess what was something like a veiled, who knows what it was, an attack or not. I mean, I don't know if you have any thoughts there.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess I've changed my mind at different points on that. When I first came to the text in light of, as I was reading through the controversy, there's this footnote where he thanks Eshman, but he does not really take up his arguments very directly there. And so I thought it struck me as sort of an indirect, while acknowledging him, a kind of indirect distancing from him. This time, actually, as I was going through and reading this last week to prepare for it, I think there's perhaps more continuity between the text and Eshman's essay. Although Eshman, I think, goes more into the concern about the idea of a hierarchy of common goods and critiquing Descartes' what he takes to be Descartes' position, that the common good of the material universe as a whole is sort of a mediating factor between God and the human person, which I think certainly Maritain would reject any view like that, but he never, he's not, Maritain doesn't present his view as a reading of Descartes, so he's not really getting at the question of whether this is Deconic's substantive position or not. He's just saying this would be an error if one took it.
Yeah, so I'm actually going to take that as our connecting thread to get to the text that bit, but I just want to float this last thing so I don't forget it. One thing that's been on my mind, kind of as I reread this, I've often said I've gone through different periods with regard to Maritain. I own an immense amount to him, so I went through my full-throated, I'm a Maritain guy. And then, doing all this like older works translation, you can't help but butt up against some of the church state issues. Um, you think, well, why didn't Maritain just clarify some of that? Right, that what he's doing in integral humanism. So I was thinking what you said about the possible condemnations that happened. I think that actually, really, in the end, Charles Journet was doing it, and he just let Journet do it because Journet was the theologian. I mean, I've just been thinking about that, looking at the first volume of Journet's L'Église. There's basically a book within that book. It's almost 100,000 words that's dedicated to this topic, church state stuff. I don't know if you have any thoughts there before we move into the personal.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't read the whole text of Journet's massive work, so I'm a bit reluctant. But I mean, I certainly do feel there's a very strong continuity between Maritain and Journet, and that they were, two minds with a single thought on many topics. So that wouldn't. I wouldn't be surprised if I were to take that position after looking at it. But.
Yeah, something I thought about, like, well, why did Maritain answer these theological objections? I think it may well have been in the sense that Journet was sort of the guy to do. But that's later. That's integral humanism. We can do that some other day.
Yes.
But let's go. I want to actually jump to what you said about Deconic, because I think it actually gives a good sense of whenever the first book. So again, to just sort of reiterate for everyone, because they may not have caught it. Deconic writes a book, on the primacy of the common good against the personalist. And then in response to Ashman writes, like you said, an essay. It's in the Laval Journal, right? The Theological Philosophical Journal.
I think it was in New Scholasticism originally.
No,
it's been reprinted subsequently in the Aquinas Review, Thomas Aquinas' college paper or journal, which is available. So it's available online from that journal if you Google.
But are we referring to? Well, but now though, I'm referring to then when Deconic writes, he writes it in his own.
Oh yes, Deconic's reply to Ashman is in the Laval Journal. Yes,
and the reply, as you said, is longer. So,
yes.
Now, well, maybe we'll end up slurring.
It's also in French and with very substantive amounts of Latin quotations.
Block quotes.
Yeah.
He kind of is doing something textual, and his approach is, and you can now outline it, I think, for our listeners. It's a very metaphysical approach concerning the separate common good of the universe. Is my sense whenever I was revisiting all of that, and there's a tendency he has, at least Simone makes this point, and Ashman as well, that there's a kind of univocism, where we're talking about the common good of the universe. I find that Maritain, we'll come to this, we talk about his response, he parses the nature grace stuff very adroitly, whereas it's not, or adroitly, it's not, however, that's not as structural in Deconic. So maybe you can just outline the very basic outline of what Deconic's sort of style of arguing about the primacy of the common good is.
Yeah, so I as I understand him, what he wants to say is that in modern philosophy, there's a fundamental problem that the good of the person or of the individual is given prominence, and that the social or political good tends to be either disregarded for the sake of the good of individuals or downplayed as a kind of aggregate of individual goods. So insofar as there's any common good at all, it turns out to be an aggregate of individual goods. And he thinks quite rightly that this is a fundamental error, philosophical error and problem. And he points out that the common good is fundamentally something that we all have an obligation and duty towards, that this common good, there's a political, there's sort of a hierarchy of, if you like, the common good of political order, the common good of the creation of the universe as a whole, and God as a separate common good, if you like. And the higher we get up the hierarchy, obviously, the more important those, or the more priority that common good would have. And he places a lot of emphasis really on this common good of the created order, which he takes to be, that which formally determines the good of the common good of as individuals participate or share in it. So that is a worry for Ashman, and I think for Maritain as well, insofar as it runs the risk of interjecting between God and the person some sort of mediating factor that persons would not relate to God, be directly related to God as the absolute good. And Ashman and Maritain to some degree mentions this in his text as well, that this is, they take to be a fundamentally Greek and Arabic view that creatures relate to God through some sort of participated hierarchy. And that's really, I think, the underlying suspicion or concern they have with de Koninck's position.
Yeah. So then, I mean, there are probably some points to be addressed regard to mediation in the supernatural order. But in a sense, because the church is going to come in for Maritain in a clear way that's negotiated well by him.
Yes,
But especially in the natural order, it's a real concern in the natural order is the placing of the political common good. The political common good in the created universe's common good become these mediators.
Excuse me, I just have to turn this.
If you need to answer, yeah, that's fine, or at least pick it up. So, just to fill for the listener, what we'll do now is maybe if you want to just outline, you have sort of an idea of where I'm going to go right after this. So we're going to talk like the individual person distinction. Yeah. So we're going to come right to that very quickly. If you want to say anything about then the text of
sure.
So it's written as a series of articles that basically is it's like an oblique response. I mean, it is a response to de Koninck, but it's not written as a response to de Koninck. It's actually viewed by someone even like Garrigou Lagrange, who only had a few little recommendations to make. And you'll find Garrigou citing it. And Garrigou himself uses some of the same tools, the person and the individual, for instance, even well into his life, even while he's consulting about the possible indexing of the stuff related to church and state, which is interesting. That you've kind of got a concern about Maritain on one level politically, but even here, a traditional Thomist is pretty comfortable with the article as it's written. So the article has become the book that we.
Yeah, and he cites, Maritain cites Garrigou Lagrange as a source, one of the sources for his use of this distinction, which is interesting. But so maybe just a quick overview of the text, because it's relatively succinct, and I think fairly, the chapters are fairly organized, at least in terms of Maritain's books. His habit, as you suggest, is followed here of initially, starting with either lectures that he gave or essays that he would publish, and eventually there would be enough material and he would kind of pull it together into a book. So oftentimes this contributes to his writings not necessarily being a systematically worked out sort of presentation. And I think often my sense is as well from reading what he was doing and his correspondence and whatnot. He was also very busy at this time of his life, so he was constantly being invited to give courses or talks and to travel and whatnot. So that does show through to some degree, although I think less here than in some of his other works. So we basically have there's 5 chapters. The first chapter sets out the problem that he's trying to solve. Does the society exist for man, or does man exist for the sake of society? Do we each exist for the sake of our community, or does the community exist for us? Here, of course, he wants to have his cake and eat it too, to some degree, and say, well, there's a sense in which both of these statements are are true. What seems to be contradictory is in fact reconcilable. The second chapter sets out some fundamental principles that will govern the discussion. Three of them. The first is the doctrine of divine providence, which addresses the good of every person for their own sake, that each person exists and should achieve the good for his own sake, not merely as an instrumental purpose for the good of the universe, again, which it takes to be characteristically Greek and Arab in an approach. The second principle concerns the beatific vision, that each soul knows God as he is and is known by God, and that this relation that we have to God fundamentally transcends any common good, and that in that beatific vision, the soul and God are united in a single act of knowledge and love. Obviously, this is through grace at that point. And then the third principle is the superiority of the speculative over the practical intellect, and how fundamental this is for politics, that human contemplation is. He has a lovely line describing it as imperfect and crucified beginning of beatitude. And I think this is really important in his elsewhere in his critique of Machiavellianism in politics, the kind of practical impetus in politics that this principle helps warn us against. The third chapter deals in detail with the distinction between the individual and the person that we have mentioned, and I won't go into it because we'll talk about that a little bit later. But basically, just in very broad terms, the individual, our individuality concerns sort of the material pole of our being, that we are physical beings, and as such are individuals. And in this sense, we are part of our political community and subject to its authority. On the other hand, we also have a spiritual dimension to our being, a spiritual pole, and this is our personality. And in this respect, we transcend the common good of the political order because we are ordered to a good of a higher order, that is God. And then chapter 4 deals with the application of that distinction to our initial problem. Does man exist for the community, or does the community exist for its members? And here he's basically applying that distinction between individual and personality to say, insofar as we are individuals, we are subject to the community and parts of it. Insofar as we are persons, we transcend the good of the community. And then finally, the fifth and final chapter deals with contemporary problems, and he basically sets out three contemporary political theories: bourgeois individualism, communistic anti-individualism, and then a totalitarian or fascist view, which is both anti-individual and anti-communism. And here in our present context, it's worth mentioning that he's referring to real fascism, where people are thrown in gas ovens and or gas chambers and incinerated in ovens, not I just don't like your thought.
Yeah,
kind of
exactly, right? Well, and it is being written in the so it's like
right in the midst of the war. So yes.
Yeah, he means that in a way that has a currency it's been degraded in our.
Exactly. And so that's really the contours of the text and as a whole. And
great, yeah. So I want to at the level of like really drawing some out at one point, just if there's anything you want to say on it, then follow up. And then one other little thing that I'm going to note, just for the potential person who's perhaps inclined to the Laval position, that heard something and was ready to jump down our throats. But the first is, I really want to emphasize this point that you make about the relation to God. He's emphasizing this even in the natural order. So although he has points of parsing that are going on with regard to the life of grace, he wants to make the point that even to be citizen does not exhaust the perfection of what it is to be human. And hence, there's an ordination of each person to God, even in the order of nature, which has to be taken into account to understand kind of the superordination among God as the good of the human person as natural, which is, reflected sort of in the idea of the what is it, like the community of minds, the moral life, the artistic life. All of these kind of are reflections, all bear witness to this. This is how I sort of think of that. But I think it's important to draw attention to that, because this is not just a nature grace kind of thing that's going on here.
No, I think that's really vital, particularly for the sake of recognizing at least what I would see as a problematic reading of Maritain, as seeking a kind of lowest common denominator with liberal individualism. So the fact that we do have this order to God as a result of natural law, which extends beyond the purely Christian dispensation, and thus is relevant even in the context of a pluralistic society, I think is really vital. And I think that's also one of the things that really attracted him later in life to the American, political experiment.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Yeah, I think. Yeah. I mean, I think I agree. I do think I agree. So the other thing was, you said about the beatific vision point about the common good there. Just, this is not even an accusation. It's just to make sure we put in people's faces the text. There's a text in question I have in mind, because Simone, I noticed it more. I probably had it underlined originally, but I noticed it because Simone kept telling him, you need to make sure that you say something about how in the beatific vision, in some sense, the primacy of the common good doesn't go away. And he did, but it's like in a footnote. But I had to keep giving to my student to say, listen, see this. But he makes the point. He says, here in the vision of God, the intentional identification, that is through knowledge and love, of each soul with the divine essence. In here, the law of the primacy of the common good over the personal good comes to an end in a certain sense. And then in the footnote attached to it, he says, number 48, in another sense, the law always holds, because the infinite communicability of the incomprehensible essence of God forever transcends the communication which, through the vision, the creature receives of it. So in other words, the fact that basically in Thomist jargon, the beatific vision is non-comprehensive indicates something about how, there's a sense in which the common good is always more than the good of the blessed soul, in the sense that it's non-comprehensive. And yet there's, in the vision of God, the personal good and the common good become, so united, precisely like the common good of the Trinity is not sort of divvied out among the persons either, in which he kind of talks. So,
anyway, it's an analogy.
It's something I worry about. Like whenever I think about people who are ready to all too sudden say, see there, he denies the primacy of the common good. He actually, in a sense, still builds it in, but with all these nice nuanced qualifications. Like he really is so nuanced on these supernatural issues.
Yeah, and I think that's a text that's helpful certainly for Simone's reading of the problem, as well as those who more recently tried to develop Simone's approach of finding a common ground between De Koninck and Maritain, like Mary Keyes, Deborah Wallace, who've argued, that there isn't as much distance between their positions as historically, some proponents of either view thought. Because it seems to be a controversy that brings out the most pugilistic side of people.
What does, maybe I shouldn't ask him, so what do you think? I'm sometimes from the via media, but sometimes to the fundamental elan of each is very different, I think, though, if nothing else.
Yeah. I mean, okay. I have some challenges with, I guess, accepting that kind of rapprochement, because it does seem to me that, particularly as we get into this question of the person and the individual and Maritain's metaphysical account, that you don't really find that element in De Koninck. And I think out of that account, Maritain wants to develop his defense of human rights through the role that God plays in this factor, that we have an order to a good outside of and beyond, above the political order, is a grounding for human rights, which I think we'll get into a little bit later.
So you brought it in. So it's at the beginning even, and I do sometimes downplay the role of the individual person, and that might well be this distinction. I may downplay it because of my own experiences, right? So I think if I can argue for Maritain by other means, I can avoid this distracting discussion. But so this is a distinction metaphysically that Maritain takes from Marie Benoit Schwalm, who was a Dominican kind of pedagogue of the generation of slightly of Garrigou, but even the slightly older like Gardet. And then Garrigou takes over, and Garrigou takes it over even all the way theologically too, because he basically sees it as something metaphysically necessary to really stress that the principle of individuation is something that pertains to Christ's human nature, but that it's not his personality. And so he thinks that this grounding of, he makes some of the similar political argument on this metaphysical ground that he himself will not give up. Garrigou is for these Christological reasons. So why don't you just explain a little bit what the distinction between individuality or quote unquote the individual and the person is, as Maritain presents it, but it's coming out
Sure.
tradition.
Well, I think one point add. I think you're quite right in terms of the proximate origins of his use of this distinction, and in Schwalm and Garrigou-Lagrange, also Gillet, who is the master of the Dominican order at the time, has a book on culture and society in the West, where he makes significant use of this distinction. So it's sort of in the air in Dominican circles in France. But Maritain does, in the text, say that this is part of the common intellectual heritage of mankind. It's not a new development. It can be found, he thinks, at least implicitly in Aquinas. But also he refers to Hindu philosophy and the distinction between the ego and the self. So he thinks this is a very natural, very broadly held distinction that we find once we scratch the surface. But what does it consist in? We're saying it's, he kind of introduces it by way of a contrast between Pascal and Aquinas. Pascal's has a passage to the effect of the self being despicable, and he contrasts this to Aquinas's passage that's widely known, that the person is the greatest marvel of nature. And so he wants to say, well, there's a grain of truth in both of these, and that's a result of this fact that we are both individuals and persons. Individuals insofar as we are material, and here there's some significant discussion of the role of matter in individuation. He has a lovely phrase for describing matter as avidity for being, that matter is what renders individuals within a common species. So it's what allows us to have many different beings that are all equal in nature. So that's fundamental and important, but even more so the role of the person. That person refers to us insofar as we have a spiritual capacity of intellect and will, that we are centers of agency for knowledge and love, and in this respect we are complete wholes. Not merely parts of another larger, complex network of relationships, but also complete wholes in our own right. Because of this, we have a mysterious interiority that demands expression through knowledge and love. Kind of a Dionysian element here of Dionysius of the divine names, not of the ancient myth. The good by nature diffusing itself to others, right? Although he doesn't cite that, it's I think not far from the surface. And he concludes his articulation of these distinctions with really four mistakes about this distinction to avoid or concerns. The one is to see the person as something separate from the individual. That would be wrong. We are, in our whole being, both persons and individuals. So the hylomorphic unity that Aristotle and Aquinas defend, he too is defending. I think this is an important point. Some will critique Maritain for having an excessive dualism here in distinguishing person and individuals. Liberation theologians will often make this critique of Maritain, that he has a dualistic anthropology, that and it's not. It's a hylomorphic anthropology, which is involves both a duality but dual aspects of a complete being. So I think that's an important error that he's warning us of. The second is would be to think of material individuality as something that is evil. That's often something that goes along with dualism, and he rejects that very clearly. Obviously, matter is the condition of our existence as individuals within the human species, so it must be something good. The condition of your existence cannot be evil. But evil does often arise when the material aspect of our anthropology predominates as a motive or in our actions. That can often lead to evil, but that does not make matter itself evil or our individuality evil. And then at the social level, in terms of education and politics, there's a risk of an anarchic view, which would try to free personality from its material limitations, treat us as if we were only persons and not really individuals. And this would lead to a kind of anarchic pursuit of self-fulfillment that rejects self-discipline or asceticism that can only bring about dissipation. And I, here I interpose my own kind of contemporary concern that it seems to me that kind of view is really at the root of a lot of the mental health crisis that we find, widespread amongst young people today. And then the fourth would be a despotic vision, which is probably less of a concern these days than it would have been in the 50s, which tries to eliminate individuality through an excessive rigidity, either in education or in social mores, an attempt to remove the heart of man and replace it with that of an angel. And he notes, well, the former operation is easier than the latter. So an excessive sort of rule based or rigidity in social structures, which one can see his concern with the Nazism in Germany as being the example he has in mind of that. So I think that's really how the text fleshes out the distinction.
Just one thing that stuck out to me at the beginning. Truth be told, I was a little bit distracted for a moment. I'm thinking, where was that in GA? So where was that?
He has a book. It's called Order. What is it called? Order in Latin Society and Culture, or in Western Society and Culture. I forget the French title. I can shoot you the reference.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, so that's good. Okay, so now I think that you give a good account then of both the metaphysics of it and the applications that are in his mind. Why don't we just go to some of the applications that could be made? So
Sure.
For instance, you brought the question of human rights. So why don't we just go ahead and discuss that, for instance? Like, so what is it
sure.
here?
Sure. Yeah,
let's go critique. There's a sort of McIntyrean critique of rights that's in the canon there, right? So I think it's good to get the strongest account of this. So I want to give you a runway to do that.
And I mean, this is really more directly dealt with in his book on natural law and the rights of man. But I think the groundwork for that argument is really found here, right? Why is it that if we are, as Aquinas says, and as Maritain agrees, and certainly DeConnick emphasizes, if we are parts of the political order, then our good is really subordinate to the common good of our political community, of our society. Right? We see Aquinas arguing like this when he talks about the death penalty, for example, if the part is corrupt and risks the good of the whole, you dispense with the part for the sake of the whole. Right? If you have gangrene in your finger that threatens your life, you cut off the finger to save the body. And so there are those sorts of passages there. However, again, Maritain, because he wants to insist that you have this order to a higher common good, a common good that transcends the good of the political order, and is not merely the common good of the material universe as a whole, but God directly, then none of the other agents that are responsible for securing the common good of a lower order can interfere with that. You can't intervene through a mere natural creaturely way between the person and their order to God as their ultimate good. Again, we can kind of bracket the question of the church, which Maritain will talk about, because that's a supernatural agency. So it's although it's mediated through earthly forms and agents, they're acting through grace. So there's not it's not a purely natural thing. And this means that there are things that the person or that the society rather cannot do to its members. Here, and this comes up, is treated in detail in chapter 4, really around two passages from Aquinas. One that relates the person to political society as part to whole that we've talked about, but the other which in which Aquinas says that the person is not related to the good of the political order insofar as all that, or with respect to all that he is and has. And so there's some dimension of the person's good which transcends that. And this means that there are limits to what the political authority can do to us, because they can, certainly insofar as we are members of society, demand sacrifice from us, quite significant sacrifice from us, sacrifice that many individualists and our many Catholic colleagues would probably have issue with. It could demand us that we risk our life in a state of war, right? We can, conscription, for example, Maritain recognizes as a morally legitimate thing in a just war to demand that you, if you're healthy and capable, that you provide military service, for instance. So it can impose those kinds of obligations upon us that require that we engage our entire being in something for the sake of the good of the community. Nevertheless, there are certain things it cannot demand of us, right? And here he wants to say, although the state can demand us, we engage our whole being, but not with respect to all that we are, right? And so he gives some examples here that we can act with our whole being, yet transcend that action. He gives the evocative example of somebody running a race. If you're running a marathon, you're doing it with your whole being. All of your intellect and will is engaged in that act. Yet it would be wrong to say that all you are is a runner. Or if you're philosophizing and you're thinking through a problem deeply, your whole intellect, your will is engaged in that. All that you are is engaged in that problem. It's a beautiful experience for those of us who are intellectually inclined, and yet not all that you are is a philosopher. Right? Your being is ordered to other goods beyond that. And so here's where rights comes in, because in order to preserve that precious relationship between the soul and God, no created intermediary can legitimately intervene in that. Aside from the work of grace, right? In the natural order, that cannot be legitimate. So rights are, Maritain thinks, are grounded fundamentally in the natural law, because as a result of natural law, we are ordered to God as our fundamental good, fundamental sine qua non for us to attain our fulfillment as human beings, and thus the state cannot transgress upon that. So freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, all of these fundamental basic rights. And here, again, rights have become a little bit debased in our kind of polemical culture, and there's sort of a minting of new rights all over the place. Here we're talking about those rights that follow from our nature as human persons, and that are fundamental and necessary for us to attain our natural telos as human persons. And so those fundamental rights are required in order for us to relate to God appropriately, and thus it would be morally illegitimate for the state to try to transgress upon them. I probably went on a little too long.
No, I think
Hopefully that gets the idea across of how this notion of the person and the common good grounds a theory of rights.
Yeah. What would you say? This is something I struggle with when I think about this. This is what will, in my more critical moments, think about the political applicability of the individual person distinction, which I do think, I mean, metaphysically, like I've never sort of questioned it. Once I saw the Christological implications, I was like, well, and it makes, I mean, also philosophically, when you talk about subsistence and everything, I mean, it makes sense within a full metaphysics. But when I think about that example of like war, right? There's part of me thinks, do I need to even ground this in this distinction? Because it really just is the personal good of the citizen to recognize a subordinate end, but a real end, injustice that is owed to to patria, to the homeland, to be engaged in a just war. Like there's part of me thinks like, do I need to bring in individual and person there as something that helps us to understand? This is more because of the fact that it's being an individual part of the society. Hence, you take up this role. Like there's just part of the things you can get that. I don't.
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I don't know that you need the distinction to ground our duty to the common good. It seems to me we do need that distinction, or at least Maritain's philosophy needs that kind of distinction in order to avoid that duty becoming all-encompassing. Because without some sort of distinction like that, our duty to the common good seems to exhaust all that we are. And particularly if the state, I mean, the difficulty I have would be, how do we explain that the state can demand that I risk my life for its good, but yet it cannot tell me what religion to practice? It cannot legitimately tell me what philosophy to teach in my classroom. It can't tell me, it may pay my salary as a university professor. It doesn't in my case, but for many of our colleagues it does. But it cannot tell them to teach Marxist philosophy or Milton Friedman. If the good of the community transcends everything. I think some account of the person and an individual, it allows us to show both that that man exists for the sake of the political community to some degree, but also there's a sense in which the good of the community has to be one that we share in as persons as well.
Yeah, I'm going to sidestep the freedom of religion things.
That may open another can of worms.
No, it would be interesting to do by itself, like to get, really get who does that to sort of see where he's developing with that. I mean, because it's interesting. He's developing in a way that also even Pius XII is making steps toward what eventually happens at Vatican II. It's one of these topics that shuts the conversation down because when people hear it.
No, I appreciate that. It's probably not the best example for me to give, but it's one that's there for him.
An example, it's relevant. I mean, to hear it's just one that can cause ad hominem some problems.
Indeed.
I'll have to think about that. That's all. Because I sometimes I sidestep it, but probably for articulating that relationship of nested common goods and limited common goods, you need to have the principle that helps you to suss out what it is as a person as part versus the person as person that's involved here. Mm-hmm. You brought to mind something that came to mind earlier too, though, that whole idea of the person and the person's relationship even to the intrinsic end of the universe, like the whole of creation, like as though the human person would just be a part in the great whole of creation. And, that sort of would be the exhausting end. Man's ordination to God as, even in the order of nature we're talking about here, to God as the separate common good, creates a very awe-inspiring is what comes to my mind. I don't know what else to say. It's such as dynamic. I mean, I apologize for looking for the right word here. It creates a situation that's really difficult to articulate because, in a sense, the free agent, in being ordered to God, is above the whole universe. Maritain cites this text from John St. Thomas where he talks about this, because it's in the context of how the angels can't know free acts. Mm-hmm. And John St. Thomas develops this whole line about how in our free acts, just as the same would apply to any spiritual agent, we are in a sense above the entire universe. That those acts, in a sense, because they are directly ordered to God, they have a kind of superordination of the universe. And they sees there like the majesty of the person vis-a-vis any created intermediary. I don't know. That's just
Yeah, yeah.
he just cites it in passing in this text, and I remember then seeing Garrigou cite the same text out of Thomas. So I was like, where have I seen that text before? Then I went back to Maritain and looked at John St. Thomas, and this is very interesting about how the
Yeah, yeah.
really stands above the universe in a sense. I mean, I think that would freak out anyone who wants to emphasize the common good, but it's a way of saying we are ordered to God, who is the separate common good of the universe, precisely in a personal, not quite as person and common good come together way as the beatific vision, but boy, it's incredibly close, the relationship between the personal and the common good there.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's one of Eschman's worries, is he sees Deconic as interposing the common good of the universe, the material creation, as a kind of intermediary between us and God as our common good, that
Yeah.
that we would only attain the vision of God commonly, if you like, rather than and indirectly through our as experienced with others, rather than directly, as
Yeah.
Maritain wants to.
Yeah, and we'll make the caveat that, I mean, there may well be the case. This is not the case for what Deconic ultimately holds. I think that Deconic does. I remember going back through. He does parse the relations of beatific vision as a common good, the separate common good that is God, and its relationship to the cosmos. But there's a real concern. Deconic has this concern that does come through, that there's a kind of collapsing of the term common good, though, and it does tend toward
Yeah,
not articulating the levels as clearly as it
yeah,
should. Which, when I came back and read Maritain very much does. He talks about the political common good, the common good of culture, the common good of the universe. God is the natural common good. God is the supernatural common good. He really kind of works out the relationships there with decent clarity.
yeah. And I think on that point, I mean, it's interesting as a learning experience in kind of the process of exegesis to look, because that question between Eschman and Deconic really rests on careful reading of a few texts, and it's very interesting to compare their readings of some of these same texts.
Okay.
If you leave aside some of the polemical
Yeah,
language that surrounds it, there is a really interesting um, take on some of these passages, but it gets into quite refined details.
yeah, and you can see it'd be interesting. Yeah, to just sort of look that way, just to sort of see what is manifested about the principles operative in the reading of these of the particular texts that are shared kind of at the core of the base. Well, we're at the move. Usually it's about an hour, sometimes we go a little bit over. I suspect that it might have, but I like to try to keep us pretty close to that, both for our listeners and for your sake. Very quickly, because I do want to, I think it's interesting just to ask, do you want to say anything about, it's like ripping the contemporary bandage off a little bit? Is there anything in your mind as we talk about this with regard to some of the discussions that are going on in Catholic circles nowadays about integralism, post-liberalism, et cetera? Or would you like to sidestep that?
I'm not one to sidestep things, so I'd rather face them head on. It's because if you don't face problems head on, they linger and come up again in worse forms.
Go face them no matter what. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, with respect to this, I mean, I think this is interesting with integralism. There is, I think that's rooted in a laudable concern to respond to the liberal attempt to remove religion from our public sphere. As I said, I kind of came to Maritain. One of my initial points of contact was critiquing Rawls and political liberalism. His second major book refers to Maritain as, somebody with a substantive notion of the good whose political theory he could agree with, or that could agree with his own political theory, which is interesting. And Rawls's project is really to limit us to public reasons that everybody could accept, regardless of their own private political views of the moral good or the religious good. So there's a laudable pushing back against that. We're often said that we're in a post-liberal society, and certainly see this in the American election. There's and the overturning of Roe versus Wade, and some of these things, a deeper moral approach, substantively moral approach to politics. and religious approach to politics. By which I mean one in which moral issues are, and one's take on them is important rather than the morally right approach, which is a different question. But I think there's some challenges here. One is that, the integralists are often seeking inspiration from earlier French thinkers in the 19th century who were often responding to the consequences of the French Revolution, the overturning of the monarchy and the role of the church in France and Europe at that time. And I think that's quite a different situation than 21st century post-liberal thought in North America. Here I have to be a little bit careful as well because I'm a Canadian, I'm not an American. I've never really lived for any period of time in the United States, although I love our brothers and sisters to the south. It's not my world, so I only pick up on it indirectly. But I think there's some pretty fundamental differences, and so trying to transpose that thought from one context to another with a different set of tensions, I don't think is as easy as is sometimes suspected. The other concern I have, and I've been involved quite extensively in Canadian politics in my home province of Alberta, and I think one of the practical problems, so there's a historical problem, I think there's also a practical problem that you start off with a good intention of evangelizing our culture, Christianizing our political life, which is a good thing to desire, and then I would share that desire with integralists, but there's a risk, and historically I think a risk that has tended to be realized or become a real problem of instrumentalizing the church and faith for the sake of political ends, where the church is simply used as a political instrument rather than for the sake of its of respecting its own proper ends and goals. Here, historically, we could look to Action Française, which Maritain earlier in his life was a part of and was condemned by Pius IX, precisely for this kind of reason, amongst others. So I think that's always a concern in trying to use the unity and bond that our faith gives us as Christians for political purposes, is always running that kind of risk. And then the last thing I think, which is often very specific to Maritain, is a suspicion, which we've talked about a little bit, that he's trying to come up with a reconciliation with liberalism, a kind of lowest common denominator that we could all agree with. Professor Pecknold at Catholic U a little while ago wrote a paper on on Maritain, where he's concerned that Maritain's philosophy is kind of underlying the secularism that we find in the UN Declaration of Human Rights. So I think that's a common concern with Maritain. I don't share that concern. I think it's a partial reading. I think really his account of human rights is fundamentally different, as we've said, from a liberal account, because it's rooted fundamentally in our natural order to God, which is certainly not the basis of any liberal thought. Liberalism wants to start with a kind of social contract between human agents and base rights on what's needed for human agents to cooperate. And as far as the UN Declaration goes, it seems to me that certainly the desire to get communist countries to sign on to it is probably more directly related to why it is secular in nature rather than including references to God directly. It also seems to me as well that Maritain's political philosophy generally is rooted in a presupposition that authentically Christian citizens will be pursuing sanctity. And so that this discussion of freedom is not license. It's creating a sphere in which the pursuit of sanctity is possible. And the free agency of Christians as citizens in the political order is what should manifest the good in a modern society. That's the whole point of this idea of a Christian humanism, of a humanism that is not atheistic. So I think integralists have tended to not give enough emphasis to that dimension of Maritain's thought.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. I'll just leave it there. I think that's all.
Yeah.
Dated. I don't want
Again,
to get a couple thoughts. It's like, what do you think about this or this? But we'll air that some other day. So even if it's just privately. So okay, quickly, what do you think is the enduring significance specifically even of this text for today's intellectual and spiritual? So why should someone read this today?
Well, I mean, the enduring significance, I would say, I mean, one, partly just out of what we've been discussing, is I think it gives a grounding for the only coherent theory of human rights there is. So that if you basically, if you don't have a religious foundation for your notion of rights, I don't think it ultimately is going to hold any water. So I think that's fundamentally important. It grounds as well within Maritain's corpus. I think it grounds what he's saying in a lot of his other political work, always referring to these texts. One of the annoying habits Maritain has is quoting himself, and in later works, he quotes back his earlier works, and this is one that he's always coming back to. So I think if you want to understand, even some things that he wrote before, like integral humanism, these ideas are kind of loosely present there, but they're very crystallized here. They also come up, later in Man and State, which is this more mature political philosophy. So I think the fundamental relation of each of us to our political community is one which, he's really giving us the basic principles to understand here. And that's something that's very much up for grabs at the moment. I mean, the current election that you're going through in the United States, these are issues, although they're not poshed out in these philosophical terms, but these principles are really underlying a lot of the discourse. So I think it just helps shed a light and help us clarify what the real arguments and differences are.
Great. And is there anything else you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Well, I mean, the one thing I suppose too I might mention is I do think that for those who are interested in Maritain's political philosophy, this is a book that's good to start with, because a lot of his other treatments of the subject are grounded very much in historical context that enters directly into the argumentation. Integral humanism is part of a very specific European situation in the early 20th century. Man and States dealing with kind of 1950s Catholicism and its relationship to the American political order. So there's a lot of background that you really have to grapple with. Whereas here, I think he does succeed to some degree in pulling out the fundamental principles and treating them in their own right philosophically. So I do think in some ways amongst his political works, for those who are philosophically inclined more than historically inclined, this is a good point of entry.
Yeah, that's so true. Because, like an example over in Simone, right? He has the book like about the French in Africa, but also to the Road to Vichy. And there are interesting things, but it's not the same as reading his lectures he gave at the University of Chicago. There's something even about Man in the State that is conditioned by the questions of that time. I think that's an interesting and correct point. Because, even a lot of this, there are essays later on, too, that you don't realize sometimes how they came out of his experience of like the 40s, right? That's what they're but they're coming out of the immediate actions he's having during World War II. Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. Well, okay, a little bit over time, but, I always consider it just hit that right now. 15 minutes over is always not a bad loss. That's, I think, within the realm of, horseshoes and hand grenades for this podcast. So I really want to thank you for the conversation here today, Dr. West. This is
thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. So Maritain Musings is a venture of the American Maritain Association. We thank you for your time here. Please visit us at AmericanMaritainAssociation.com. And we'd like to also thank Mr. Michael Hall for his post-production work on the podcast.